Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, one of the civic partners for our show. Today I have two guests in the studio. They've both been on the show before, but this is the first time I've had them at the same time. So Steve Todd is the superintendent of the Jefferson-Lewis BOCES, and Tom Burns is the superintendent of St. Lawrence-Lewis BOCES, although only for about 2 more months before he retires. So welcome back to both of you. I am excited to talk about education and what's happening here in New York State. So our
Well, thank you
very,
for having us, Donna.
oh, you're welcome, Steve. So this very late state budget this year made it tough for North Country schools to get their budgets ready for voters on May 20th. But all 36 schools in your two districts did pass their budgets. This will make it easier for everyone going forward, at least for the 24-25 school year. Tom, what were the significant impacts on education in the state budget this year? Was there good news for local schools?
Well, that's a tough question the way you ended it about good news. But let me preface it by saying I think this year's budget really started with last year's budget when the governor threatened to remove Save Harmless, which was the minimum due amount for most of our districts who have enrollment losses. And so that specter was looming, and they convened this Rockefeller report over the course of last year. And so they proposed some new measures in terms of foundation aid. And, that I'll use a Star Wars term. Whenever there's a disruption in the force, we fear that. And when they put some of these new measures into place, we never know how that's going to go. So back to the statement I made about good news. For most of our districts, they did not see good news in this budget. We have 18 districts. About 6 of those districts got at or near the minimum due increase of 2%. I had 3 districts who really took a hit and are, they're not on life support, but they're facing some critical times. And then I had 3 districts that did benefit and got above average. So again, I would say 2/3 of our districts didn't make out very well. And just broad brush, all the federal money's gone, and it looks like state finances are going to be more lean. And I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, I think that's a safe statement to make. Steve, just really quickly, how did your districts make out with the state budget? Are you seeing the same dichotomy that Tom just spoke of?
Yeah, similar. I've got 18 school districts. About a half of them are under that Save Harmless window, and they received the 2% increase, which isn't enough to keep up with the rate of inflation. Last year, we were fighting to get those people back to zero. So, did we make some progress from last year? Perhaps, but still, it's a level of austerity and uncertainty for that half. The other half of my districts got anywhere between 3% and 6%. So depending on what their enrollments have looked like and their poverty levels. So yeah, it's not all roses for everybody. One thing I would add, though, that made it into the budget that I find very exciting, we've been advocating for more than a decade for the reimbursable amount of BOCES aid that districts get for BOCES salary to be increased from the level that it's been at for the last 35 years to something that's more reflective of the real average salary of a BOCES employee. That made it into this year's budget for the first time in a very long time of advocacy. So over the course of the next 3-4 years, because of our high participation rates, and I know this is probably true in Tom's area with very high participation rates in CTE, our districts could see some significant increases in BOCES aid because of that.
That sounds like real positive news. And of course, one of the really good pieces I think that came out of the budget is the fact that the free and everybody's going to be able to participate in the school meal program without having to go through any hoops, jumping in terms of having to certify what their income is. So that takes all of the stigma away from that for sure. And that is good news for everybody. So, Steve, the federal government, as you both have just mentioned, always has an outsized impact on North Country schools. We have limited property wealth and certainly limited ability to raise local taxes to cover any shortfalls on either state or federal funding. So, what other than what you've spoken about, what impacts are you seeing from the pullbacks in education funding on the federal side, because we don't really know how bad it's going to get, do we?
We don't. And I think the biggest job that I've found we've had and probably will have moving forward is just helping people to grapple with the uncertainty. Uncertainty equals anxiety, and anxiety is not good for anybody in education. There are things we can control, and there are things we can't control. There are things we know, and there are things we don't know. And I think I've found I've had to be kind of more than ever before the voice of, let's not worry about things we either don't know or can't control. Let's control the variables we can. Let's be very mindful of the advocacy and educating ourselves about what is going on. But we do know and it's changed. It'll go 180 degrees in 24 hours in terms of what we think we know about some things. But one thing, I guess, taking it from that level of about 10,000 feet up, maybe down to 5,000 feet is, even if in this federal big beautiful bill, there are not direct cuts to Title I and IDEA and other education funding streams. If there are huge cuts to Medicaid, it will affect us in a negative way. We just don't know what the Senate's going to do with it at this point and what the president will ultimately sign. And so there's anxiety, there's uncertainty. We do know even where the monies have been allocated and where they have not been sequestered or cut, the loss of staff at the Department of Education appears to be causing delays in the processing of things. So one example is our Perkins monies, which come for workforce development, CTE-based funding. They were months later than ever before, the allocations. Now, at the end of the day, when we found out a couple of weeks ago what our allocation was, it was fine for this year. It hadn't been cut. But not knowing for a long time made it much harder for our people to then submit our Perkins resubmission. So that level of uncertainty is definitely complicating things.
Yeah, and that's of course true across the board, not just in education, but for people who provide all kinds of services. And it just makes everybody's life that much harder. So one area of real concern is going to be the impact on special education. I know special education services are key in both of your BOCES districts because you provide services that individual schools simply cannot provide. They don't have the staff, they don't have the expertise. Tom, what do you see coming down the road for special education needs students who've been provided for in the last 50 years by federal programs like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Section 04 law? What's going to happen into some of those programs, do you think?
So I would echo Steve's sentiments here about having to be the counselor in chief and, just tell people to calm down a bit and see where some of this lands. Really 30,000 foot, a lot of these changes that are being made until they're approved by the Congress, right? They're just proposals. And a lot of these things are already have been appealed and taken to court and they're still, at the court level. So we're doing a lot of waiting. And the other thing I would say is through the reconciliation project, the monies that the previous Congress already approved, there were some initial threats there to withhold some of that funding. And I would just say to people, just to reassure people, most of the things through the reconciliation process, for example, we talked about title monies, those monies turned out to be secure. Again, it made people nervous, but we've had to kind of work with our federal advocates and see where that's going. You mentioned IDEA, so the original Public Law 94-142 in the 70s. I think it's hard for us sometimes to stop and just pause and imagine what life was like for students with disabilities prior to that. And again, the overarching concern we're seeing is that this administration doesn't really like to give any group of individuals or students special status, if that's the way I could phrase it. But this group of students I'm very concerned about because there's the legal promise of IDEA that they get a free and appropriate public education in whatever setting. And but then there's the funding and the programmatic side of how that shakes out. And Steve identified, I think, the largest area of concern, which is Medicaid. Many of our students with disabilities receive Medicaid, and which could be anything from medical care to food services. And then some of our students who are not identified also receive those services. We don't know what the financial impact might be, but I think Steve is right that it's going to hit a state like New York harder than many other states across the country.
Well, between the two of your BOCES areas, you have school districts of every size and every description, from very rural to small cities like Watertown and Ogdensburg. And just about all the potential consolidations were done decades ago in terms of actually trying to combine districts. There really isn't any way to do that given the physical distances that we're talking about here in the North Country, regardless of how small some of these schools are. We simply can't put kids on a bus for 3 hours in one direction to try to consolidate, can we? I have real concerns about the talk of eliminating the Regents diploma, since it seems to me that we might end up with a two-tier system where the larger schools who can afford to hire teachers that they need to provide a well-rounded education will be able to continue to do it. But the smaller schools just don't have these resources without the state saying they must. Back to Save Harmless that you both talked about a little while ago. So if we lose the Regents diploma setup, is this a valid concern that we're going to have rural schools who simply cannot give an appropriate education because of finances?
I would
Tom?
defer to Steve. I would defer to Steve initially on this because Steve sits on our district superintendent's standards, instruction, and assessment committee. And so he was intimately involved with the graduation measures work. So I think he should kick this off.
I'd be happy to jump in on that. So the first answer to your question, Donna, is yes, it's a valid concern. And that really is the thrust of our work, I think, over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years, making sure that that worry doesn't come to fruition. Because if we do things the way we have always done them, then what you are talking about, your concern, will come to pass. The haves will have more, the have-nots will have less. But that really puts the onus on us to not do things business as usual. And I have hope that I think we have an opportunity now. There is, I'm sure you're aware, a major thrust across the state being led by the 37 BOCES to discuss regionalization opportunities. Now, not consolidation. What you've described about, we probably picked all of the low-hanging fruit in terms of bringing school districts together in our area, in our neck of the woods, into physically the same school district. But functional consolidation, increasing the sharing, increasing the cooperation between districts to make sure that if I have such and such a program that's really good and you have a different program that's really good, that we find ways to make sure both of our groups of students have access to those, and that as a region that we maximize all of those opportunities. Tom's region and my region have always been good at sharing, have always been good at regionalization. This is nothing new to us. We've picked all the low-hanging fruit and all the medium-hanging fruit. But so the onus on us now is to get very creative as every region of the state is working on these regionalization plans that we'll be submitting on October 1st to find every possible way to ensure that we're able to provide our kids with everything that the Portrait of a Graduate calls for, so that one district doesn't have things and another district doesn't. That's a tall order. And it's something that if anybody can pull it off, it's North Country. We are better at this than anybody else, but it's not going to be easy, that's for sure.
You remind me, just a minute, Tom, you remind me of the fact that the BOCES system got started right here in the North Country. And it was for exactly those reasons that it got started. And it was such a good idea that it went all across the state. So I'm sorry, Tom, I just wanted to get that in because it's a little kind of a forgotten piece of BOCES history, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually you were going right where I was headed, which is I like how Steve has set this up in terms of the choices districts can make in pursuing this, but it also aligns with the historical, you mentioned the founding of BOCES around 1948, and people forget that this consolidation that you spoke of was really fueled by a post-war economic boom and a population boom. And none of those two things exist anymore. So Steve is right. We're going to have to do this differently. And I think, when I think about the 2008 recession, we had a number of school initiatives, regionalization type initiatives. They all ultimately failed because we recovered from the recession and the federal government came in with ERA monies to kind of offset the losses. But in this case, I think it's really going to be centered around staffing more than finances. And, yes, state finances are going to tighten up, but we're already having staff shortages across both Steve's region and mine. And so schools are having to be creative, right? And we're going to have to share those resources to provide those opportunities for students that we have in the past. And it will look different.
I'm thinking back now to what happened during COVID when everything was shut down and we went basically to online schooling. And in some places that worked better than others. One of the real problems in the North Country is the lack of broadband that is accessible and affordable to every family. And I remember stories of buses equipped with Wi-Fi that went out to communities so that the kids could have a place to actually hook up to their online classes. So, and we've seen the federal government now want to pull back away from expanding broadband. So that's going to be a real hurdle that we're going to have to overcome when we talk about this regionalization of services, isn't it? To make sure everyone has access.
Absolutely. And I think, in recent months, and I saw a poll the other day that I forget which of the news media outlets came out with it, indicating that in recent months, we as Americans are starting perhaps to recognize that the things we do together through government are not necessarily bad things. They're good things. And that doing things together of value is something that perhaps we'll come back as a society, as a nation, to championing and celebrating. But broadband is one of those things. I mean, investments, big investments that benefit us all. We can't do it alone, any of us.
That's right. So another area of concern is the federal focus right now on charter schools and private schools. A lot of attention is being paid to them, but in places like the North Country and much of rural America in general, these options are just not available. How concerned are the two of you about the emphasis at the federal level going towards school choice in places like ours where no real choices exist?
Donna, I'm very concerned about this, and Steve knows that for the last several years I've been part of the American Association of School Administrators group that goes and lobbies in Washington each summer with superintendents from across the country. And this school choice narrative is one that's not new, and it's being promoted heavily the last few years by Republicans in the House primarily. And I think you're right in saying that currently we don't have a lot of those schools in the North Country. But I think it's a little dangerous to say, there aren't any of those schools here now and it doesn't threaten our system. I do think that this is a somewhat of a frontal assault on public education, this constant talk of school choice. And I think language is important here. So what I would say is let's use the proper terminology and let's use vouchers, because this is the vehicle that some politicians want to use to expand this. And anytime public funds are used to support private school tuition, it's a voucher. You can call it whatever you want to, but it's a voucher. And the last few years, I've been reading Josh Cowan, who's a professor at Michigan State University. He's kind of a leading researcher on vouchers and some of the intended and unintended effects of vouchers. But just to summarize a couple of bullet points, very often vouchers go to students who are already enrolled in private schools. So we're subsidizing something that doesn't need to be subsidized at the federal level. And the other thing that goes on often is kind of a wink-wink arrangement where if vouchers are to be provided in certain states, those institutions raise their prices. they raise their tuition. So we're just subsidizing increases in tuition in those places. And when we look at some of the other studies, private schools don't get better results than public schools do. They're not held to the same standards. And then from an equity standpoint, they can exclude students. And they very, very often do exclude students. And oftentimes it's students of color or students from economically challenged backgrounds. So these are all things that I think we should be very concerned about. The devil is in the details with these voucher initiatives at the federal level.
You know,
I agree completely.
Tom makes a good point about the devil is in the details, which is true about every budget proposal that's out there right now at the feds, isn't it, Steve?
Absolutely true. And while looking at the details is important, I'm going to take us back up to about the 20,000 foot level in terms of the public school system, that it is one of the last defenses for us as a society of our free democratic society. If we rob that institution of vital resources, which is exactly what these moves would do, then we would weaken our free public education system and we would weaken our democracy. I think that's an enormous threat.
I could not agree more. And one of the points I think we need to make, people are rediscovering how important civics education is through the last few months and all these attacks on all of the public institutions that we have come to rely on. So this really is an opportunity, isn't it, for public schools to really focus on civics education, not just for the students who are in school, but also for the communities that they support. We need people to understand what is happening, how to advocate against it, and how to make sure that we protect these institutions that we rely on that you two have just described so well.
I think you're right, Don. And actually, I want to circle back to something that we talked about earlier and connect it to that. The new graduation measures, graduation requirements, that includes de-emphasizing the Regents exams for all, not eliminating the Regents exams, but broadening the number of ways that a district and a student can demonstrate that a student is ready to graduate, built around something called a portrait of a graduate. All of the various competencies and skills and experiences that a good citizen needs to have to be ready to live in this world are wrapped up in the portrait of a graduate. And a big piece of that is being a good citizen, civics education, community service. So I'm encouraged that we're moving in a direction that I think is going to strengthen that.
Well, that is certainly good to hear. And, you know, I'm always amazed when someone who is all of a sudden newly paying attention to what's going on say, well, that's not what I voted for. And of course, it is what they voted for because they didn't do their homework ahead of time, did they? So as we start to wrap up here, look into your crystal balls and tell us what is coming down the road for the next school year. Tom, you're ready to retire. Your replacement has been named, so your prognostications won't be hitting you in the office the way the Steve's will. What do you think? What do you think we need to be paying attention to for the next school year, Tom?
Well, it's, the start of each school year is exciting and it's not all gloom and doom. We have some great things going on in our regions. The first thing I can think of, which we're excited about and we're several years into, is there will be continued work around literacy initiatives in our region. And there's a new requirement from the state that all of our districts sign on to a literacy attestation saying that they are using science of reading, evidence-based practices in the schools. Those are very effective strategies. We're getting more and more teachers trained up each year and implementing those reading programs in our elementary schools. So we're happy about that. That work will continue. Steve talked about regionalization. And the final regionalization plans are due October 1st to the state. And we'll need to get sign-offs on those and have some convenings. And like Steve and I talked about, this is nothing new in our region, but we do have to bring in other stakeholders to share with them, what are the areas that we see that more sharing can be had and more effective use of our resources. So the other thing we talked about, we know we're probably entering a period of belt tightening. at least with our state funding. Districts will have to prepare for that. They'll have to be looking at their use of reserves and looking at their staffing levels and doing audits of both of those. And then the last thing I think that, again, is across the region we're looking at is use of AI in terms of instruction, in terms of, more efficient administration of our school programs. And that's just an area that's changing daily. That is exciting.
Steve, I was just reading today that some businesses are no longer looking so much at degree programs for incoming workers as they are who have technical and career education skills, which, both of you guys work on. I know that's a big part of your BOCES. So what do you think the future holds for the CTE program, Steve?
Well, I think the future for CTE is massive and growing. I'm sure Tom is seeing comparable numbers to us, but let me just kind of throw out there just for perspective. 4 or 5 years ago, we would have about 1,000 to 1,100 students per day, juniors and seniors, in our 2 technical centers. Out of our eligible juniors and seniors in our region, that was somewhere in the ballpark of about 30% of the eligible juniors and seniors. Next year, the 25-26 school year, we will have at least 1,600 students in those same spaces that haven't gotten any bigger since then. So we've had to get very creative. We have grown from this year 1,350, which we thought was our maximum capacity. We're finding room for 1,600 next year. We're going to be well over 50% of the eligible juniors and seniors. I know Tom's region is probably looking at comparable percentages and trends. But what you're talking about, Donna, is absolutely true, not just in our region. I'm hearing it from colleagues around the state and around the country that CTE is hot right now. It's not college or career. It, in many cases, is both, but kids that have tangible skills that they then take forward into higher education. I can also tell you, I sit on our local community college board, Jefferson Community College, and enrollments have been down dramatically there, as they have at most higher education institutions. And in order to meet the new demand, Jefferson, like others, is sort of retooling and moving towards more of the skills-based, micro-credential based education rather than the traditional 2-year associate's degree. So it's what you have described is absolutely true, and we see it playing out in our region in a big way.
Well, what's interesting is that as people are crushed by the burden of student loans, now that they've restarted, that if you can get a good education that will allow you to get a good job, and you can do it through programs like this, you're not going to have that student loan debt hanging over your head for the next 20 or 30 years. So it makes plenty of sense. And goodness knows we need people who can do things. It just is absolutely critical that we have those skill sets out in the community to help people solve problems.
It's true, but I've got to say too, I'm a big fan of the traditional college education model as well. And I think there's lots of room in our society for both a vibrant 4-year college. I'm a liberal arts guy from St. Lawrence, and there's a lot of demand and need for that as well. I just think I'm just very happy to see that the trades and CTE are getting their due regard and their due demand now, because I think that's good for us that we haven't de-emphasized that as we have perhaps in the past.
Well, thank you both today for coming in together, because this has been a real treat for me. Steve, we're definitely going to have you back when October 1st rolls around to get a look at what some of those regionalization plans are going to look like, at least up here in the North Country. Tom, have a great retirement. You have had a wonderful career. You have done so much good in your district for the schools and for students, for generations of students now. So thank you both for your time and all of your work to make the North Country better educated and more vibrant.
Thank you, Donna, and congratulations, Tom, and thank you for all you've done for me and for all of us over the years.
Well, I appreciate it from both of you. Steve, it's been a pleasure for us to have worked together so often and so well over the years. And Donna, you've provided just an amazing service to the communities. Steve and I have been on the program several times, and these are just great conversations that can be shared. So kudos to you for starting this and continuing it all these years. It's just a great service to our local democracy.
Well, thank you.
Amen.
Thank you. I didn't start it, but I have continued it. So at any rate, well, let me remind our folks that these conversations are a production of North Country Matters. This show is a civic collaboration between the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next time, remember, our North Country matters and our education system really matters.